This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Spyderco SpyNano, and this is how you do a small knife right, albeit with one little issue. So let's get right into the specs here. So the Spyderco SpyNano is Spyderco's most recent design in its annual collaboration with Lionsteel, where they take one of Lionsteel's designs and make it more Spyderco-y. So based on the Lionsteel Nano, the SpyNano has pretty much the same specs with a 2.75-inch blade, this high drop point, a relatively thick blade stock at 150 thousandths, we will talk about that more, and this tall, flat grind. The knife is 6.20 inches overall and weighs 3.1 ounces or a little more than an ounce an inch. Your blade steel here is M398, which is M390 but M390er, meaning it's a little less tough, a little more corrosion resistant, a little more edge retentive. On the show side here, you got this really nice green, OD green micarta. Spyderco very often uses very nice micartas on their knives. This is no exception. And on the lock side, you've got a titanium frame lock. Your clip mounts on the butt here for very deep carry. This is about as deep carry as a knife can get. And like the Spy Mito before it, it's got Lionsteel's removable flipper tab. And so this little Torx bit here, it's easier to see when the knife is closed. This flipper tab, you can use this Torx bit to remove that flipper tab. The primary reason that Lionsteel does that is because they are a European company, and in some jurisdictions, flippers are legally discouraged. I'll put it that way. And so you can make it so this knife only opens with the opening hole just like that. It also means ergonomically, if you don't like this little flipper tab sticking out here, you can remove it and get a flatter bottom surface of the knife. It is a cool little feature. I haven't taken advantage of it because, as I'll talk about, I love this flipper tab, but it is there if you want it. The SpyNano, the minimum advertised price, so what you'll find at most retailers, is $236. And while this is a sprint run, you can still find this one on the internet with a bit of searching. It didn't sell out instantly quite in the same way the Spy Mito did, as is pretty typical for these smaller knives. So this is a small knife, so let's get some size comparisons. Here is your small Sebenza, so you can see even shorter than the small Sebenza. Here is your large Sebenza, and you can see the large Sebenza absolutely dwarfs it. Here is your Benchmade 940, and here is your 945. So you can see even shorter than the 945. Let's get your TRM Neutron in here and your TRM Atom. There you go, just like that. And then last but not least, you've got a Spyderco PM2 here, and probably the most interesting comparison, the Spyderco Para 3. And I'm going to put these right next to each other because I do think there's a lot, even though the Para 3 is a little bit bigger, I think there are a lot of similarities between these two knives in how they're used, how they feel, and in who's going to enjoy them. And I think that, you know, this Para 3 is probably your closest reference point for how the SpyNano is going to sort of look and feel and its use case. We'll get into that toward the tail end of this review. So I usually start my reviews talking about the function of the knife, but here I'm going to start with the design, because the SpyNano is simply a cool little knife. So on both the show side and the lock side, and I'll talk about the lock side because it's a little more visible here, you've got this relatively complex milling pattern. It's sort of catching the light here. It's not truly contoured. You know, you've got a flat and then bevels here, but you do have these huge bevels that slant down from this big plateau across the center of the handle. And those bevels themselves are complex. This isn't a flat bevel. You can see how it sort of curves here, it curves in here. So even though the whole handle isn't contoured, these bevels are, you know, more complex contoured shapes. There's this micro milled pattern, the same one they had on the Spy Mito, which is probably used by having a ball mill just sort of bounce up and down a little bit there. And those same patterns are on the micarta side. You can feel them. You obviously can't see them with the variants of the micarta, but the show side does have these exact same milling patterns, which is just nice. The overall handle shape, which is really, some subtle curves, a bunch of straight lines. It feels a little futuristic, a little almost like Blade Runner-y. To me, it just feels kind of cool. And honestly, this look of, titanium and micarta has that kind of retro future vibe to it that, you see every once in a while in the knife industry, and is just kind of generally cool. As is typical for Spyderco, I mentioned before, this micarta is very high quality. You got a ton of fabric in this micarta, a ton of texture. Both provide some great grip and a lot of potential for patina. And the way these big sweeping lines of the blade flow into the handle, and the way the whole knife just looks like this stout, chubby little tool. It's interesting. It's unique. Nothing else looks quite like it, other than obviously the Lionsteel Nano. And I think it's just cool. Then you've got little details like this butt-mounted clip. And you've got this pseudo-floating G10 backspacer. It's actually mounted in there, but the way they mount it here, it looks like a floating backspacer. That's cool. You've got a nicely crowned spine on your blade here, as Italy tends to do. You've got that removable flipper tab. It's just lots of cool little details that make this knife feel just a little bit extra. And, it just makes it a little bit more fun. But then let's get to how the SpyNano feels in use. And as usual, we'll start with the blade. If you take away the Spidey hole, this is a pretty basic drop point. You've got a relatively high tip, thick blade stock, albeit with a nicely crowned spine, a little bit of belly, actually a decent bit of belly, and a bit of flat, and your typical Spyderco full flat grind. The blade shape is nothing fancy, but it works, especially in a smaller knife like this. With this high tip and a whole bunch of belly, it's plenty easy to get this tip up, around, and over whatever you need to. There's enough cutting edge here that this knife can work its way up into larger tasks like cutting through cardboard, sawing through stuff in the garden, your task around the house, stuff like that. The main drawback you get for a high drop point like this, which is, that tip can be a little inaccessible if it's a larger knife. The fact that this knife is small means it's so easy to just pinch up on this knife and get down onto that tip that it's not as much of an issue as it is sometimes. So this ends up being good at those general EDC tasks in a way that often you want sort of a lower tip to really excel at those tasks. You get that same sensation here just because of how short the blade is. For stuff like scoring surfaces, cutting through packaging tapes, anything where you need that more precise cutting performance, that tip is still decently accessible. The crown spine isn't just nice to look at, it's also just nice on your thumb. And it is really easy to anchor your thumb either over the top of the blade here or right behind that Spidey hole when you want a little bit more pressure on that knife to put a little more force behind that blade. It's all simple, it's well designed, and it just works. The big drawback is this blade stock, 150 thousandths, is thick. That's thicker than the PM2. That's approaching hinderer thickness, and at times you do really feel that with the SpyNano. There are a couple upsides to blade stock that is this thick. It makes the blade a little bit heavier, which means the action is a little bit more satisfying, and as we'll talk about later, the action on this knife is great. It means that the tip here is plenty robust for, aggressive stabbing, piercing, even a little bit of prying. But it does mean that even with this tall, flat grind, the SpyNano doesn't cut all that well. It cuts well enough that you can get most tasks done, but you would never call it slicey. And you can feel it wedge its way through continuous cuts like cardboard. That it's a pretty similar grind to the SpyMito. I liked the blade performance on that one. But with a smaller knife like this, where you've just got less leverage over the blade, any bit of resistance you feel with that cut, because of how thick that stock is and how thick that edge can be, It's all just a little more exaggerated with a smaller knife, just because you do have less to hold on to, which is part of the reason that small knives tend to have relatively thin blade stock and go for those lighter and medium duty EDC tasks. Every ergonomic challenge is magnified on a smaller knife. So, if you're looking for a tough little knife, if you look at the blade stock here and compare it to the Para 3, you can see it's hard to tell because of the spine crowning, but it's about the same as the Para 3. And if you want something in that realm, you will get the same sort of feel with the SpyNano here, but just as one of my criticisms with the Para 3 was that this blade stock is just thicker than anything I really want or need in a 3-inch or sub 3-inch folder, that remains true here. It's just not what I generally want in a knife that has the inherent ergonomic limitations of a smaller form factor. But it does mean it's cool. And then the last thing, I don't really think that thick blade stock makes all that much sense with an edge retention focused steel like M398, but I digress. The handle, on the other hand, is simply great. It's chunky, it's nicely rounded, and it has all sorts of sways and swells and humps that just mold wonderfully into your hand. I'm going to mostly show the show side here, the lock side, because it's just easier to see those contours. With the flipper tab attached, you've actually got two primary grips. My favorite grip is actually getting up past the flipper tab, sort of having like a trigger pull right here. Using that as an anchor point, the rest of this knife just rolls right into my palm, and every finger finds its resting place. It's got this big fat butt here, nice and chunky, nice and rounded. My fingers wrap right around that. This is as hand-filling and secure a grip as I have ever handled on a sub 3-inch knife. And as a result, this is a knife that I feel very comfortable pushing hard. Now, again, you still don't get nearly as much leverage as you would on a handle that is just bigger, like a PM2, but as far as 3-inch knives go, this is an extremely comfortable handle, an extremely robust and sort of confidence-inspiring handle. And then, when you do want to choke back behind that flipper tab, your fingers get a little bit more cramped. There isn't quite space for 4 fingers comfortably. My pinky is falling off the end here. If you've got larger hands, this will be a 3-finger knife behind the flipper tab. But you do have that really nice Spidey hole thumb ramp here, which does give you a place to anchor your thumb for a little more traction. I think if you don't like choking up on the flipper tab, then you are probably going to want to take this flipper tab off just to give yourself a little more space on that handle. Again, especially if you've got larger hands. But one of the great things about this handle, whether you're choked up or choked back, is you do feel like you have tons of control over this blade. You're kind of holding the blade very much on this knife, and that means that it's just a little bit easier to control it. You've got a little bit more of a sense of really being on top of that edge for whatever tasks you're doing. And honestly, to bring back that Para 3 comparison, the SpyMito to me feels like it is doing what the Para 3 is trying to do. I haven't made any bones about the fact that I really do not love the Para 3. The Para 3 is trying to be a hand-filling, chunky little knife. And, it's got all these big sways and things like that, which do lock your hand in. It's nice, but the SpyMito just feels better. It just fills the hand like a larger knife, even though it is a smaller knife. It feels like a small knife that is designed and meant to really be pushed and put into work. Even though this front scale is full micarta, there's no bend to that scale. It's plenty stiff. You can see no liners at all, but the micarta is thick enough that it just doesn't bend at all. There's no hot spots anywhere on this scale. If you really bear down, there could be a little bit here, but honestly, I don't think it's an issue. It's nicely knocked down everywhere it needs to be. And honestly, it's just one of the most comfortable small-handled knives that I have felt in a really long time. And ergonomically, putting these knives next to each other, it's so much more comfortable in the hand to me than the Para 3, despite being an even smaller knife. So the ergonomics of this handle, really, really good. And then there's the action. The action on the SpyNano is awesome. So first off, this is an Italian-made Maniago, Italy Spyderco knife on bearings, and I haven't always had the most favorable things to say about Italian knives on bearings, whether that's from Spyderco or Giant Mouse. Sometimes they have been gritty, sometimes they've taken a long break-in period, sometimes they've had a lot of play, but much like last year's SpyMito, the bearings here are just a little bit gritty at first, but they smooth out quickly. And while they're not glassy like a truly high-quality bearing action like you would get from Riyadh or, Grimsmo or Hinderer or anything like that, they are smooth on the open, nice and smooth, and it is shake shut on the close here, which is plenty good enough for a knife of this size. The detent is definitely stiff, and to me feels just right. So using the Spidey hole, there's a real deliberate reverse flick, or my preference, a sort of thumb flick or thumb roll to overcome that stiff detent. But once you do, that blade absolutely flies out of the handle with a nice and satisfying thwack. It's solid, it's crispy, it's almost Hinderer-esque, which was a comment I made about the SpyMito as well, how that sort of Spyderco makes a Hinderer feel to it. It demands a little bit more of a push, but it rewards you with that really snappy feedback. The lock bar here is a little bit on the stiffer side, but the lock bar access is really, really generous, so it's easy to disengage. And then there's a flipper tab. I love this flipper tab. It is much like a Hinderer again. It points away, or it points sort of forward. It points toward your finger. Rather than using jimping, it's this short, rounded hook. But that hook is easy to get your finger around, secure, and when you combine it with that stiff detent, it is so satisfying to use, so satisfying to break that detent and snap it out, that it's probably my single favorite Spyderco flipper to date, and honestly, it's one of the best small flipper knives I have handled. It really does have that Hinderer-esque vibe to it, kind of the same feel you get out of an XM18, albeit a 3-inch one, though I do think this handle is significantly ergonomically superior to the XM18 3-inch, which I didn't love. These small flipper knives can sometimes be an ergonomic disaster. Very often it's just hard to hold the knife and get your fingers around that flipper tab. It ends up feeling cramped. It ends up feeling, just uncomfortable. But the SpyNano does it really well. So between the crack of that stiff detent break, the nice acoustics you get, the smooth and satisfying feeling of the bearings, I found myself playing with the SpyNano all day when I've been carrying it, and it's just a fun little knife. So you put all of that together, and the SpyNano, much like the SpyMito before it, is a surprisingly great little knife. It's light enough to be easy to carry, chunky enough to fill your hand even under harder use. And while I do wish the blade stock was thinner, it still absolutely does the job. Add the excellent action on top of that, and you've got a knife that I've consistently enjoyed carrying, and one that I've been looking for excuses to put in my pocket at the start of the day. So let's bring it back to the most apt comparison and the most familiar one for most folks here. Let me put them this way so they sit flat. The Spyderco Para 3, because lots and lots of people love the Para 3. I am not a fan of the Para 3. I think it's ergonomically mediocre. I don't love the thick blade stock, and I do think the compression lock can be a little finicky and require a little too many finger gymnastics on these smaller knives. The SpyNano fills virtually the same role, and I do think it's equally good or even better across the board. These knives both have thick blade stock, and while I do love the leaf-shaped blade, this little drop point is just as versatile, just as precise. It never gets in the way. Do I wish the tip was a little bit lower? Sure, but with a blade this short, again, it doesn't matter nearly as much. The ergonomics on the SpyNano are simply better. The way the curves and the overall thickness of this knife, and you can see it's not even that much thicker than the Para 3, it's just the contours make it feel so much better. It fills your hand wonderfully. And it does it without forcing you into a single grip, into a single hand position like the Para 3 does. There's a lot more cool factor here with the extra levels of fit and finish, and with that really excellent detent, that really excellent action you get on the SpyNano. I do think that fit and finish and the overall fun factor is just a couple notches higher on the SpyNano than on the Para 3. And so it just feels a little bit more elevated. It feels a little bit more high quality. And so the SpyNano, obviously it's a sprint one, so it's harder to get than this Para 3, and it's about $50 more. It doesn't have that same tool-like aesthetic. It doesn't have that same, I want you to just beat the snot out of me look and feel that the Para 3 has. So a lot of that's just because of how people have used their Para 3 over time. That's not inherent to the knife. But if you do want a little knife that is both fun and useful, especially if you like the idea of that, but you didn't love the Para 3, I do think the SpyNano is worth a serious look, because I really think it does everything the Para 3 is trying to do a little bit better than the Para 3 does. So I had pretty high expectations of the SpyNano after how much I enjoyed the SpyMito, but I'd argue the SpyNano is an even better knife. It just does what it's trying to do really, really well. And in design, in fit, finish, execution, all that, it's just a really good knife, a really good collaboration between Lionsteel and SpyMito. So really nicely done from both parties. This has been Clark the Knife, and I will see you on the next one.